Good afternoon. Welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. 2017, of course, is a year of anniversaries. Today, we're discussing one anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War. Later this year, there's many other very important Middle Eastern anniversaries, some less known, some better known. Martin Kramer has an article out this week on the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which is being marked in the beginning of November. Just a few days later, does anybody know what the big anniversary on the 7th of November is? The 75th anniversary of America's landing in the Middle East, Operation Torch, from World War II. And at the end of November is the 70th anniversary of the partition resolution on November 29th. So it is definitely a year of anniversaries. This, of course, is an anniversary that has not only historic significance, but pressing real-world significance. And there are many ways to recall what happened 50 years ago and to connect it to today's events, all of them worthy and legitimate. I know that there are events, conferences, seminars, lectures in many different places looking at different aspects of the impact of the Six-Day War, whether it's the military impact, the political impact, all of it quite important to recall. This being the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, an institution that focuses on American policy in the Middle East, we thought it most appropriate to take this moment to focus on the American angle. What went into American decision-making before, during, and immediately after the Six-Day War? What drove our leaders to make the decisions that they had? What was the process of decision-making? What are the implications of that American experience in and during the Six-Day War for U.S. strategy after the war, for the long-term engagement of America with the parties to the conflict? That's what today's event is about. And I really could not be more pleased than to have this trio of experts talk about the legacy of LBJ, the Middle East, and the '67 war. What went into the thinking of President Johnson? How did other actors in the administration approach these issues? And what is the lasting imprint of the decisions made in those fateful days of May and June on American policy in the Middle East? To start, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Dennis Ross. In addition to his own personal experience in the making of Middle East policy over the last 25 years, Dennis is an author and historian on America's engagement in these issues. And if you haven't already read Dennis's Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israel relationship from Truman to Obama, now is an excellent opportunity to pick it up because among its many fine chapters is a chapter on LBJ, the '67 war, and the Middle East, in which there are all sorts of fascinating nuggets that give us a window into the thinking of President Johnson and the decision-making process in the administration. So first I'm going to turn to Dennis to give us the strategic context of this episode. Then I'm very pleased to turn to Nicholas Rostow. Nick is currently the Charles Evans Hughes Visiting Chair of Government and Jurisprudence. That is a wonderful mouthful, appropriate for a man of Nick's stature, experience, and expertise. At Colgate University, a former special assistant to Presidents Reagan and Bush, and legal advisor at the U.S. Mission at the United Nations. Nick is also a wonderful historian who likes to delve deeply into these issues, and he brings the special attribute of knowing this from the family angle as well as the professional angle, given that his father and his uncle had critical positions in the Johnson administration. His father, Gene Rostow, serving as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and playing a major role both during and after this episode in the diplomacy surrounding the '67 war. I'll just say, I'll note as an aside that I was proud to know Gene Rostow, and Gene was a member of the Washington Institute's Board of Advisors, and very proud to have had him in that position. So I'm glad Nick is with us. Welcome, Nick. And then speaking third is a member of our current Board of Advisors, Professor Michael Mandelbaum. Michael is Professor Emeritus of American Foreign Policy at Johns Hopkins University's NITSA School, an author of a long list of sterling books on American foreign policy, including most recently Mission Failure, America in the World in the Post-Cold War Era. Michael is going to talk about the implications of the '67 war episode for broader American foreign policy. And I'm sure that when we wrap all this up, we will have a fascinating discussion about what all this means, both then and today. So I'll turn first to Dennis. If I could just mention, this is all being live streamed and Facebook Live, so if you could please turn your cell phones to stun. You are definitely welcome to tweet out as much of the brilliance you hear over the next hour and a half as you like. Dennis.
Thank you, Rob. Having done a long chapter on this, shrinking this to 15 minutes, on the one hand, is very difficult. On the other hand, it forces a discipline to sort of pull out what you think is most important. So in this case, what you're going to get is what I think is most important. We'll see if you agree that it's most important. I want to start by just saying something about LBJ. LBJ is probably someone who, at least in my estimation, after having researched and gone through every administration and also having been a part of a number of them, I believe that Lyndon Johnson was probably the most emotionally attached, emotionally committed to Israel of any American president, from Truman until today, which may seem like a strange statement to say because he's not necessarily thought of that way, but his background, his connections go way back. His aunt, who influenced him, was a member of the Zionist Organization of America. He, during the run-up to World War II, he was very active in terms of helping get refugees, Jewish refugees, who couldn't get into the States, into the country through Galveston. He took a trip as a congressman in June of 1945 to Dachau, and it affected him in a profound way. In the aftermath of the 1956 war, when Dwight Eisenhower was trying to make the case for why we should impose sanctions on Israel if they didn't withdraw from the Sinai, and he tried to persuade Johnson, who was then the majority leader of the Senate. Johnson completely rejected it. And when he becomes president, he's the first American president to receive an Israeli prime minister at the White House. To be fair, this is something that President Kennedy had agreed to before the assassination, but Johnson not only carries through with it, notwithstanding a lack of enthusiasm for it within the bureaucracy, but he also later, after the 1967 war, he has Levi Eshkol come to the ranch as a way of signaling a kind of special connection, a special relationship. He's the first American president to provide Israel offensive weaponry. John Kennedy breaks the taboo on providing weapons, but he provides Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, a purely defensive weapon system. And it's Johnson who is the first to provide tanks and aircraft. And then before he leaves, he makes the decision to provide F-4 Phantoms, again, something that's opposed by both the State Department and the Pentagon, unless, at a minimum, we impose certain kinds of conditions on the Israelis that are related, in the case of the Pentagon, to Israel joining the NPT. In the case of the State Department, wanting Israel to accept that they will withdraw fully from the territories if they're going to get the weapons. And Johnson basically overrides their opposition. So here's a guy who has this emotional connection. Here's a guy who demonstrates over time this kind of a unmistakable commitment and a resistance to what he faces when he's president within the bureaucracy. And yet, when you look at the weeks from May 14 up to June 5, May 14 being the day that the Egyptians begin to mobilize forces and send them into the Sinai, until June 5, there's a whole series of things that take place, and he's missing in action. Right? So what takes place? Well, Nasser sends 6 divisions into the Sinai right to Israel's border. Nasser closes the Straits of Tiran. Nasser on May 29th gives a speech to the Egyptian parliament in which he says, not only have we reversed the results of 1956 because he's now blockaded the Straits of Tiran, he has Egyptian 6 divisions on Israel's border, but he says we'll reverse the results of 1948 as well, meaning we will avenge the loss of Palestine. The day after he does this, King Hussein flies to Cairo and puts his forces under Egyptian leadership. We have the president of Iraq who is saying we're going to wipe Israel off the map. And Johnson essentially is missing in action. So how do you square this? How do you explain this? Well, here's where the strategic context comes in. There is a part of Johnson, for sure, who wants to avoid any kind of confrontation with the Soviet Union, but that's not the issue. It comes into play during this period, but it's not the issue. The issue is Vietnam. Vietnam is overwhelming. It consumes all the oxygen. It is a complete preoccupation for the military. The Pentagon is opposed to do anything that will divert assets away. When Johnson later tries to put together a flotilla, the Pentagon is completely unenthusiastic about it. It isn't just the military, it's the intelligence assets are devoted again completely to what's going on in Vietnam. And domestically, Johnson has lost his moral authority. Johnson has almost no capacity to convince the Congress to do anything. It's an interesting thing to recall. The Congress in 1967 is unwilling to respond to Johnson on almost any foreign policy issue, but they also are not interested in playing any kind of military role in the Middle East, even if it's coming to the aid of Israel, even if it's coming, in a sense, to live up to commitments that were made. Because, again, the impact of Vietnam is so great. The Congress of 1967 doesn't look a whole lot like the Congress of today. So there is the Vietnam creates a broader context. When you dig deeper, what you find is, not surprisingly, Vietnam was also a complete distraction. I mean, again, some of how this period unfolds, you see things that seem hard in retrospect to understand, but they took place. When I say distraction, when the Israelis come to the administration after Nasser closes the Straits of Tiran, and they remind the administration that Eisenhower, when Israel left, has made a couple of commitments. One commitment is that if the straits are closed, Israel will have the right of self-defense and therefore militarily could act on its own to deal with this. But the second commitment is that because this is an international waterway, we will go ahead and we will act to ensure that it's open. Now, when this is conveyed to the administration, no one is aware of it. Literally, no one is aware of it. Johnson asked Walt Rostow to go to Gettysburg to find out from Eisenhower, are these commitments real? They can't find a record of it in the State Department, and so that's why they sent him to Gettysburg. Now, one of the things that's striking, of course, one of the books that I was reading when I did my Eisenhower chapter was to go back and look at everything that Eisenhower wrote. Well, he wrote a book called Waging Peace that came out the year before. And in the appendix, one of the appendices of that book, it has the aide memoir that's sent from the State Department to the Israelis that outlines these two commitments. But the administration can't find any record of the commitments, which is, shall we say, at a minimum, not a great example of record keeping, but also an indication of just how distracted I think the administration was. But there's a better, that's an interesting one. There's a better example of being distracted. The one thing that guides Johnson from the beginning of this is the desire to avoid a war. Now, one of the really striking things, if you want to avoid a war, when Nasser goes to Uthant, makes a request to the UN to withdraw the United Nations emergency forces that have been there since they've been in place in the aftermath of the war in '56. Basically, Uthant sort of says, well, I can't pull out some and not all, it's all or none, and of course Nasser says all. But once the request was made, there was a perfect opportunity for us to intervene. If your aim is to avoid a war, and you certainly want to play a delaying action, and you don't want the Egyptian forces to enter, and you don't want the UN forces to leave, so that at least you have this separating presence, well, then you ought to be doing something to resist or convince the Secretary General not to act. Now, what makes this even more extraordinary, Dag Hammarskjöld wrote a letter to the Israelis and to the Secretary of State Dulles at the time, again, when the UNEF was being inserted into the Sinai, and he says that they cannot be withdrawn without a process that reviews whether their mission has been fulfilled. Now, Uthant, by the way, knows nothing about the letter, so it's not only the United States that has a problem with record keeping. He knows nothing about the letter, number one. Number two, why aren't we active? Why don't we go and say, look, here's a commitment made by the Secretary General. At a minimum, let's review the status of the commitment. Let's review whether what he says is being fulfilled. Has the mission been achieved? The answer would have been pretty obvious. For anybody who has worked at the UN or associated with it, you know one thing about it, it's pretty good at sort of drawing out discussion. And yet, again, we're missing in action. Now, Arthur Goldberg is our ambassador at the time, and he brings the letter to Ralph Bunche's attention, not to Uthant's attention. And he kind of says, well, Bunch had forgotten about it, and he was kind of old and sick, and he kind of drops the ball. But we're not doing anything. And again, I attribute that to a kind of complete distraction. At a minimum, you would have thought if the administration was determined to try to find a way to avoid war, it should have been focused on, all right, how can we draw things out at the UN and how can we prevent the withdrawal of the UNEF? But basically, we are missing in action there as well. And then there's what I call the broader mindset that exists within the different parts of the national security apparatus. And here there's a perception of Nasser that doesn't quite fit with reality. It is striking that Harold Saunders writes a memo to the president that the National Security Advisor, Walt Rostow, delivers 2 days after the Egyptians have mobilized their forces and sent them into the Sinai. Now, to be fair, they haven't. The memo is written prior to the formal request for the UNEF to leave the Sinai. Still, here's a memo where the Egyptians have now begun to insert, at this point, about 4 divisions into the Sinai. And the memo doesn't focus on this other than to say, Nasser is one of the coolest customers in the region. Now, he's not using the word cool in the sense that he's a cool guy. He's using it in the sense that he's a cool calculator. He's a very cool calculator, and he's not interested in war. And if we want to affect things, we should encourage the Israelis to have a quick in and out into Syria militarily. Now, the reason was Syria is actually I'm not going to go through all the background of everything. Syria is a key player in creating a set of circumstances and events that helps to lead to the war. But the striking thing here is the way Nasser is described and the sense that, well, he's put these divisions in and we can ensure that nothing happens by just sort of shifting the focus to Syria. You could argue there's a certain logic to it, but ignore something else. Once Nasser has done this, Nasser is suddenly celebrated again in the region. Nasser has been riding a losing streak. Since the end of the UAR in '61, the entry into Yemen, there is a war of words, and it's not only between the Saudis and the Jordanians, the monarchies with Nasser, but it's also the Ba'athis are in a war of words with Nasser as well. One of my professors was Malcolm Kerr, and he wrote a really extraordinary book called The Arab Cold War, and it's all about what was the Arab Cold War during the 1960s. Nasser has lost all of his luster and all of his stature until he announces he's sending his forces back in to the Sinai. Suddenly, he's a hero again. The idea that he was going to give this up, which the memo implies without fully getting into, I think was generally unrealistic. But that was part of the mindset in terms of how they looked at Nasser. And you'll see, as I get into this just a little bit more, there is a mindset also about the Israelis. I mean, the interesting thing here is Nasser is the one who has changed the status quo, and yet the entire focus of the administration, once they realize there's a crisis, is to ensure that Israel doesn't act. So there's going to be 6 divisions on Israel's border, but Israel shouldn't act. When Abba Eban comes, and he doesn't come until May 25th. Again, this starts on May 14th. He doesn't come till May 25th. And when he comes, one of the things that he says to Dean Rusk before he sees President Johnson is that Israel has intelligence that Egypt might be prepared to strike. Now, in fact, there was such intelligence, so much so that the Soviets at that point tell Nasser that Egypt shouldn't strike. But the response of Dean Rusk to Eban is, we see no evidence, and I hope this isn't an excuse for Israel to go ahead and strike, because if it is, it would be a horrendous error. And everything that then goes on in the meeting that subsequently takes place with the president's tone is completely different with Eban. It's much more sympathetic, but it's also the tone of someone who is very constrained. The fundamental line that is repeated over and over again at this point by the president is that Israel will be alone only if it acts alone. The president says to him, we can't be responsible or assume to be responsible or take on any responsibilities and act if you go ahead and act, in a sense, preemptively. He goes on to say, in response to fulfilling the commitment, by the way, the commitment he's going to fulfill is opening the Straits of Tiran. He's going to do it through a flotilla. He says to Eban, I'm not a feeble mouse or a coward, but I can't do a thing without a process. This is getting back to his domestic constraint because of Vietnam. The interesting thing is he's talking about his constraints. He makes it very clear he's committed to this flotilla, although he worries about how strong he was in terms of how he says this afterwards. He goes to Arthur Goldberg afterwards and he says, do the Israelis think that I'm actually going to act now? Maybe not only on the flotilla, but maybe against Nasser. And Goldberg assures him that no, because you qualified it by saying you have to act consistent with constitutional processes, that's your way out. Now, the interesting thing is, even if we could have opened up the Straits of Tiran, that still would have left 6 divisions on Israel's border, which would have been an untenable position for Israel. They would have had to keep their forces mobilized. There was, in other words, a kind of readiness to accept somehow that the status quo had been changed. If you go back and you look at the cables that were coming in from the embassies, for those of us who've lived in this world, Jake, none of these cables would have surprised you. They uniformly said, look, we should accept the new status quo. I won't quote them now in great detail, but there's one in particular that says, look, Israel's an artificial state. We have no real interest in it. Our real interests are with the Arabs. Let's just accept this new reality. Without anybody asking the question, well, would the new reality really be stable? All right, so maybe you open the Straits of Tiran, but Egypt has 6 divisions on Israel's border. Nasser would have just been highly successful. Would the pressure not have built to actually do something about this, to fulfill what he said on May 29th about avenging the results of 48? Anyway, that's not asked. Now, Johnson, even though he's missing in action, when the war takes place, he reverts to his own instincts. There's no pressure on the Israelis to stop until June 10th, when there's a perception that maybe they're moving towards Damascus. And even then, the pressure comes up only because we get a message from the Soviets on the hotline, on the red line, whatever it's called, in which they warn that they might have to act unilaterally. I mean, we see this again in 73, but it happens on June 10th. We actually move forces close to 50 miles from Syria in response to this to deter them from acting. But basically, there's no pressure on the Israelis to do anything, to the idea that they should stop. Secondly, he consciously adopts a position that is very different from Eisenhower. He says, we're not going to do what Eisenhower did. We're not going to repeat the idea that Israel should withdraw and what they get in return is a fragile ceasefire that will break down. His position is Israel should not have to withdraw until they get peace in return. And in fact, he gives a speech on June 19th that is a forerunner in many respects of UN Resolution 242, which doesn't come till November. He lays out a number of different principles, and the essence of the principles later become embodied in 242. What's interesting is that same day, on June 19th, the Israeli cabinet adopts a secret resolution in which they will agree to withdraw to the international borders with Egypt and with Syria in return for peace. It doesn't get rescinded. It gets rescinded later, but only after Nasser adopts his 3 no's at the Khartoum summit in August of 1967. What is interesting, I mentioned a readiness in that resolution to withdraw to the borders of Egypt, the international borders of Egypt and Syria. There isn't one when it comes to the West Bank because even though there isn't complete consensus within the cabinet, by the way, this is a national unity government that has Begin in it, the vote is 10-9 in favor of this resolution. But there isn't consensus on the labor side when it comes to the West Bank. One striking thing again is that the Moshe Gazit, who is the director of the research part of the IDF, the intelligence part of the IDF, he writes a memo immediately after the war in which he says, look, we don't want to be occupying 1 million Arabs. This will be a major problem for us. And he actually suggests at that point a demilitarized, independent Palestinian state. Moshe Dayan doesn't agree with it, and he says, look, he will chair a committee that will look at options for this. The reason nothing is there on June 19th is because they've just begun their discussions. One other point is that Levi Eshkol, who, even though I haven't gone through what was going on within Israel at the time, you have to understand between May 14th and the beginning of the war, given everything that's coming out of the Arab world about we're going to wipe Israel off the map, our armies will meet in Tel Aviv. What's going on inside Israel at the time is that the Israeli public is digging trenches around each of their cities and also preparing cemeteries for mass graves in the expectation that this is really an existential struggle. And because Eshkol is more focused on ensuring that there's not a replay of 1956, meaning a gap between us and between Israel and the United States, he pays a terrible price within Israel. He's forced to create a national unity government on June 1. Moshe Dayan comes in as defense minister on June 1. And he's lost a lot of his moral authority within Israel. And in the aftermath, when these committees are being set up, initially he wants to play a role. He wants to decide what will be done in the West Bank, but he ends up deferring to Dayan because, in a sense, he doesn't have the same kind of political weight that he had before. Well, as you can see, I can go on for a long period of time. I promise not to. So let me just conclude with 2 thoughts. One, the war has a profound effect on Israel's attitudes towards whether or not it can ever depend upon anybody else. The shorthand is the answer is no. Here were commitments. The U.S. didn't live up to the commitments. The UN presence in the Sinai meant nothing because it could be withdrawn. So the message from an Israeli standpoint was, you count on yourself. You can't depend upon anybody else. Even the United States is not reliable in a circumstance like this. Maybe you don't want the U.S. to be opposed, but the fact is you have to act on your own. The second thing, and this gets at some of what I call the revisionist history, that kind of the Israelis planned this war all along. This was a trap that they drew Nasser into. What's pretty clear in the immediate aftermath is that this was a war that was forced on the Israelis that they didn't expect. There were no plans for the West Bank at all. The fact of the matter is the government tried very hard to persuade King Hussein not to join the war. So they had no plans, and they sort of had to do that from scratch. The fact that Dayan was waiting for the phone to ring after the war with the expectation, all right, maybe something will happen now, but the fact that by June 19th you do have a cabinet decision to withdraw to the international borders also suggests this was not seen as being a war of conquest. This was seen, in the end, as being a war that was forced upon Israel, and their success, maybe it reflected the military's confidence that they would do well in the war. I don't think anybody anticipated that they would produce what they did in the time they did with the relatively, they lost 700 dead, which is not a small number for Israel, but is compared to what you see in 1973, it is a small number. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rob, although asking me to follow Dennis Ross is not something I would compliment you for. But anyway, it's a great honor to be here. And let me just say that in 1992, I want to begin with some general observations, but in 1992, the Washington Institute held a session on the 25th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 242. The publication of the proceedings has the subtitle, "The Building Block of Peacemaking." Dennis Ross was one of the participants in that discussion, and perhaps he alone would not be surprised that 25 years later, the final acceptance of and peace with Israel has remained, I had originally written just over the horizon. I think over the horizon is a better, take the just out, or that Resolution 242 remains the building block of peacemaking. The fact that it's still the only agreed framework for Arab-Israeli peace is both testimony to the skill of the negotiators and draftspeople, but also the apparent permanency of the issues addressed. And it recalls, to me anyway, that Jean Monnet's approach to problem solving. He believed that one never solved problems, one changed the circumstances and conditions in which they arose. Now, I'd like, before getting to what I was asked to do, which is to talk a little bit about the U.S. Negotiating history of the resolution, some general thoughts. First of all, in May 1967, as we've just heard, the Israeli government and people believed that their lives were at stake. The U.S. government had a more optimistic view of the possible result of war, but did not minimize Israeli perceptions or even the basis for them. Nor did it minimize the role of the Soviet Union in fueling the crisis that led to the war, or the risks that such role posed for international peace in the area and more generally. The National Security Advisor, my uncle, told the president that the U.S. commitments to Israel were to prevent Israel's destruction and stop aggression, either alone or through the United Nations. And in reviewing the diplomatic record, one detects great urgency under the usually calm prose of U.S. official reports. Now, at the same time, U.S. intelligence estimates were rather sanguine about how the Israeli military would stack up against the Arab militaries, and I think that's one point that's probably worth recalling. I think another is just the general world of government. Dennis stressed the lack of initiative with respect to the UN and the withdrawal of the UNEF. Brought to mind the decision in 1994 to threaten to veto any Security Council resolution that would have authorized anybody to do anything about Rwanda on the ground that that was just a UN ploy to do nothing as usual. But we never thought, as Dennis suggested we should have, in that circumstance, how about energizing and seeing what other people might be encouraged to do? Now, a second thought. The right to use force internationally in self-defense is, in the first instance, self-judging. And a state may use force in self-defense against an armed attack until the UN Security Council takes measures necessary to maintain peace and security. The state's judgment is its own. It must meet customary international law standards of necessity and proportionality, and the Six-Day War epitomizes the lawful use of force and self-defense. And this was the consensus position in 1967. It certainly was the U.S. government position. The blockade of the Strait of Tiran, the encouragement of guerrilla attacks against Israel, the mobilization of armed forces, the placement of Arab armies under unified command, and the calling for war to annihilate Israel constituted an armed attack, or if you prefer, an imminent armed attack, leaving no alternative to the right to use force and self-defense. All peaceful avenues for resolving the crisis had been explored without success. UN Secretary General U Thant, as we heard, who an American official described as a shiver in search of a spine to run up, had withdrawn without delay the UN emergency force stationed on Egypt's side as a guarantor, Egypt's side of the border with Israel in 1957 as a guarantor of the post-Suez peace. There was no reasonable basis in May 1967 for concluding that continued diplomacy would restore the UNEF, would cause a demobilization of Egyptian forces, the end or the rescission of the blockade of the Straits of Tiran, etc. Israel's use of force was proportional, targeting the military forces arrayed against it, and for a time at least, it achieved the lawful purpose of bringing to an end the situation that had given rise to the lawful use of force. I reached this conclusion notwithstanding the fact that President Johnson told the Israelis that he thought they had made a mistake in attacking when they did, just as he told the Egyptians that they made a grave error in blockading the Straits of Tiran, which constituted an armed attack in violation of international law. Johnson probably was thinking more long-term and may have had U.S. intelligence assessments in mind. The third point I want to make before I get to the guts of this is defeat for Israel was not an option. Not for Israel would there be the possibility of existence and no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation. Defeat meant the end of Israel. This goal is what the Arab leaders held out as their purpose. They presumably meant what they said. On the other hand, the Arab states were not going to disappear no matter how badly they were beaten. So there's a great asymmetry in all of this. Now, I was asked to address the U.S. approach to the war and its diplomatic aftermath, and I just have a few grace notes, or maybe not, to add to what Dennis said so well. One has to do with Lyndon Johnson and his decisive role in all this. The record is replete with, first of all, the records are available online and they're fascinating reading, the diplomatic records. They're replete with purely Johnsonian touches. His use of anecdotes in meeting with Arab ambassadors, for example, saying, this was after the war, but he said he tried in May to persuade Nasser not to go to war, but that didn't work. He had pleaded with Foreign Minister Eban not to go to war, but that didn't work. Now making Israel pull back is easier said than done. And he had found in situations like this again and again that one party to a dispute urging a third party to become involved always assumed that the third party had influence over the second party that the third party did not have over the first party itself. For instance, the president said Senator A asked him to use influence with Senator B that Senator A knows the president doesn't have over Senator A himself, and the same is true in the Arab-Israeli dispute. And he said, there's some similarity to a marriage. Once it gets into trouble, a third party may be useful in salvaging it, but that third party risks the worst kinds of abuse for meddling. I'm not sure the ambassadors fully understood him, but in any event, it was characteristic of Johnson's approach. The second thing is that the record is replete with American officials from the National Security Advisor on down referring to Nasser as having slit our throat or cut our throat by blockading the Strait of Tehran. And that's pure Johnson. He regarded Nasser as having cut his throat from ear to ear. And I remember my father saying that at the time. Rusk even used this phrase in a meeting with the Jordanian foreign minister in October 1967. Secondly, I think the U.S. position in the run-up to the war, as Dennis said, was to try to prevent a war and to use all its diplomatic assets to that end. But as Dennis said, the president was handcuffed by the war in Vietnam. The Secretary of State was frequently recorded saying, you can't renege on our commitments in Southeast Asia and fulfill our commitments to Israel. It just doesn't work that way. And when the president tried to put together an international flotilla, he felt he needed a new congressional resolution, even though in the 1950s there had been a congressional resolution authorizing the United States to use force to assist a victim of aggression from international communism. Now, the United States knew enough about what the Soviet Union was doing to foment this crisis and to provide misleading intelligence to the Arab states to try and get them into a war, which they hoped would suck the United States in to a second Vietnam in the Middle East. So one could have made the argument that the 1950s resolution worked, but the president wasn't willing to do that. And he couldn't get another resolution out of Congress. Now, a third area is the role of the Defense Department in all of this, which Dennis is right. They were worried about Vietnam and about transiting the Suez Canal, ships going to Vietnam. But they also thought the Israelis were going to win. And they thought that was, you know, sort of sporting. For once our allies were going to win. Let them win. I mean, treating war as a football game, which is really not sensible. Now, it's perfectly true that the State Department did not have a record of Eisenhower's commitment to Israel, and the Israelis showed the seventh floor in the State Department the original letter. And there were a lot of things about the 1956 campaign and settlement they weren't aware of, including, I think, the whole set of arrangements which were agreed to in the form of speeches given at the UN General Assembly, in which the commitment was made to preserve the status quo and to guarantee it. But people come and go in Washington, and memories are short, and people are busy, and archives are what they are. Office file cabinets are full of maybe irrelevancy when it comes down to crises like this. And I think a lot of officials learned a lot more after they left office than they knew at the time. Now, Johnson, on June 19th, as Dennis said, gave a very important speech on the Middle East, and he laid out the five ideas that became embodied in Resolution 242, and even the Soviet Union could not object. And they were, every nation in the area has a fundamental right to live in peace and to have that right to live respected by its neighbors. For the people of the Middle East, the path to hope does not lie in threats to end the life of any nation. Such threats have become a burden to the peace, not only of that region, but a burden to the peace of the entire world. And they have to agree to this in order to be true to their pledges to the UN Charter. He saw and said there has to be a new energetic effort on behalf of refugees. Why? Because, among other things, there were 100,000 refugees from the West Bank as a result of Jordan's refusal to stay out of the war. There will be no peace, the president said, for any party in the Middle East unless this problem is attacked with new energy by all, and certainly primarily by those who are immediately concerned. Maritime rights must be respected. Arms control, arms races have to be curtailed. And respect for the political independence and territorial integrity of all states in the area is essential. There has to be adequate recognition for the special interests of the three great religions in the holy places of Jerusalem. And fundamentally, troops must be withdrawn. But there must also be recognized rights of national life, progress in solving the refugee problem, freedom of innocent maritime passage, limitation of the arms race, and respect for political independence and territorial integrity. The basic and most fundamental point was that Israel would not be forced out of the territories it conquered without peace. That's the point that Dennis made, and it was fundamental because that's what happened in 1957. The Israelis were forced to withdraw from Sinai, and they did not get a peace agreement with Egypt. Each of these points became part of 242, and the process was arduous getting there, but Israel held important cards. And I think after the original pressure of war had come to an end, then states were more willing to look rationally at this whole problem. And even by October, Nasser privately was talking about indirect agreement with Israel, and if they could make progress on the refugee problem, opening the Suez Canal to Israeli shipping. Rusk's position at the beginning of November in a conversation with the Soviets was, let's go for principles and not try and settle this in a resolution. And that's why 242 is set out the way it is. It does not dictate a peace, but sets out the principles that have to be respected. Now, I've gone over a bit, so I will pull it to a close. I would just want to say something about this meeting today and this consideration of the Six-Day War. I think it's really important, and I commend the Washington Institute for doing it. I hope we don't have to do it every 25 years, but if we do, so be it. Why is it important? At the United Nations, at the International Court of Justice, in other fora, people don't talk about this history. They behave and talk as if Israel woke up one day and decided, let's just go grab some more territory. They do not recognize that the Six-Day War was an act of self-defense, and they don't discuss in any way any of the issues we've talked about today. Second, it's not only the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. In 3 days, on June 4th, it will be the anniversary of the French version of the Balfour Declaration. The Foreign Minister of France issued a letter to the Zionist organization saying they would look with favor on creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And the third point, I think, is that despite the U.S. position, Israel has never really stood alone in any of these conflicts, that Johnson may have felt constrained but as Dennis said, he was alone willing to start the real arms supply regime that presently exists with regard to Israel, and to lay out the requirement that all states have to recognize and accept Israel. And I would say that in this year of anniversaries, it's worth remembering that the whole Balfour Declaration and all its many tendrils, if you will, all add up to the need for mutual respect and finding a way to accommodate rights in the same area of Israelis and Palestinians and others. And in a world of nuclear weapons, one would think that the imperative to do this would be obvious, but it's not. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you all for coming. My remarks concern not the war itself, not what happened in 1967, not the details of the crisis and the fighting, but rather the long-term consequences of the war, and in particular, the long-term consequences for the United States. The war had one overriding consequence that has pervaded the region and shaped the policies of the parties to the conflict ever since then, and that was and is the establishment of Israeli military supremacy. Now, Israeli military supremacy has obviously been important for Israel. It's a fact of life to which the Arabs have had to adapt and have adapted in various ways, only one of which is peace. But the fact of Israeli military supremacy has been and continues to be a major strategic asset for the United States. Why is that? How is that? Well, to pull back initially to the blimp shot, since 1945, the principal goal, or the minimal goal of American foreign policy, not the only goal, but the first goal, has been to prevent the hostile domination by a single power of the three great areas of geopolitical contention: Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. And in that goal, the United States has been successful. So for these three areas, the American goal resembles and is, in a way, a descendant of Great Britain's traditional policy for Europe, which was to prevent any single power from dominating the continent, from which position it could menace the British Isles. And the British fought their major modern wars to prevent a single power from dominating the continent, whether it be the Spanish Habsburgs or the French Bourbons or Napoleon or Germany twice in the 20th century. For the United States, the three regions were similar in that for most of the period since 1945, the principal threat in each of them was presented by the Soviet Union. But the Middle East differs from the other two regions in two ways that are salient here. First, unlike in Europe and in East Asia, the United States did not have to deploy American troops on the ground in the Middle East. And one important reason for this, not the only reason, but an important reason, was Israeli military strength, combined with the fact that Israel did not seek, and in fact actively rejected, the presence of American troops on its territory. Israel has proven to be a reliable surrogate for the United States in this volatile region, and that has meant that American policy in the Middle East, on the whole, not always, but on the whole, has assumed the form that Britain preferred for 4 centuries, namely the role of offshore balancer. The United States was the balancer in East Asia and especially in Europe, but there it was an onshore balancer, and that was more expensive. So at the very least, Israel has helped save American taxpayers money. The Middle East differed from Europe and East Asia in another way. The challenge to American interests, the challenge to establish a hostile hegemony, has come in the Middle East, unlike in Europe and in East Asia, from local powers that were and are friendly to, first the Soviet Union and then Russia, but were not part of the communist coalition. And in resisting them, in each case, Israel was important. Nasser, as you have heard, challenged the United States, sought regional supremacy in the 1950s. He experienced setbacks, but in the early days of the 1967 crisis, he seemed set to resume his challenge to dominate the region. Israeli military put an end to that challenge. Saddam Hussein, in 1991, posed a similar challenge. His invasion and occupation of Kuwait meant that he not only controlled Iraq's oil and Kuwait's oil, but without a counterbalancing force, he was in a position to intimidate and control Saudi Arabia and thereby control a large portion of the world's oil reserves, which would have given him considerable leverage against the United States and its allies. Well, in 1991, as we know, the United States broke with its pattern of staying offshore and sent an army to the Middle East. That army did defeat Saddam Hussein, and it did it without direct Israeli assistance. In fact, as we recall, the United States insisted not only that Israel not be part of the anti-Saddam coalition, but that it refrain from responding, from retaliating militarily against Iraq, even when Iraq fired missiles into Israel. And yet, in this second response to a bid for hostile hegemony in the Middle East, Israeli military power was crucial. For a decade before Saddam's invasion and occupation of Kuwait, Israel had conducted a raid on its nuclear facilities, its nuclear reactor at Osirak, and destroyed it. At the end of the 1991 war, American intelligence discovered that Saddam had come closer, much closer, to getting a nuclear weapon than the Western intelligence communities had believed at the time. It is therefore reasonable to suppose that but for what Israel had done a decade earlier, in 1991, Saddam Hussein might well have had nuclear weapons, in which case the course of the crisis would have proceeded very differently and surely not to the advantage of the United States. Now, this Israeli role in bolstering American interests has been largely unappreciated, and the reason is that it is, by its nature, invisible. Israel has contributed to American deterrence, and deterrence is not visible or palpable. There was an important exception to this pattern in 1970. In the fall of that year, Syria moved on the Kingdom of Jordan, an important American ally in the region. In collusion, if I may use the term, with the United States, and really at American request, Israel mobilized militarily and was prepared to intervene to block Syrian troops. And that was important in King Hussein's survival and his ability to discourage and fend off the Syrian assault. So in that case, the Israeli role in the larger American strategy and the role of Israeli military supremacy was clear, but in general, it has not been visible. And if I may offer an analogy from a realm in which I actually do consider myself an expert, namely sports, Israel has acted in the Middle East like a player in basketball who is an expert at blocking shots. The shot blocker's contribution to his team's success is to discourage shots that the opposing team would otherwise have taken if not for his presence and might have made. Now, the discouraged shots, the shots that are never taken, do not show up in the statistics of a basketball game. And similarly, the major Israeli contribution to American policy over the long term in the Middle East does not appear in the historical record. For history, after all, is the chronicle of what happened, not what did not happen. Finally, recently, Israeli military power did play an explicit role in American Middle Eastern policy, but it was explicit because the American government deliberately and, in my view, foolishly, chose not to make use of it. Iran today, like Egypt and Iraq before it, is seeking to dominate the Middle East. Its program to acquire nuclear weapons forms part of its efforts to that end. President Barack Obama sought to place restrictions on that program through negotiations and did reach such an agreement with the Iranian government, the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, in 2015. Now, ordinarily, the outcome of an international negotiation reflects the relative strengths of the parties to it. In the JCPOA, however, the United States, despite being far more powerful than Iran, made major and potentially very damaging concessions. The Islamic Republic retained its facilities for enriching uranium, something all American presidents, including Obama, had vowed not to permit, and the limits on Iran's nuclear program expire after 15 years, leaving Iran free to get the bomb at that point. The reason for this seemingly counterintuitive outcome was Mr. Obama's clear unwillingness to make use of America's substantial military advantage with a credible threat to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. Still, a substitute for a credible American threat was available. The Israeli government announced that it was prepared to launch such an attack if the United States would not. Israeli military power and Israel's track record in using it made this threat credible. But far from using this as leverage in his dealings with Iran in order to secure an outcome more favorable to the United States and its regional allies, Mr. Obama very publicly opposed any Israeli strike, even hinting that Washington would punish Israel if it dared to launch one. No doubt the American president had several motives for his Iran policy, apparently including the belief that offering the hand of American friendship to the ruling mullahs would cause them to moderate their foreign policy, a belief not borne out by Iran's conduct after 2015. And while the ultimate consequences of Obama's nuclear bargain cannot yet be assessed, one thing can be said of it with certainty. In negotiating it, the Obama administration squandered what has been, for the United States, the extraordinarily valuable legacy of the war that is 50 years old this month. Thank you.
So fascinating, and so we started with a detailed look at what was going on in May and June '67, and brought it all the way up to where we are today with American foreign policy and dealing with Iran in the Middle East at the moment. So there's lots of different threads of this that we can pull out. I just want to ask. I just want to focus on one or two and then turn the floor over to everyone else. And I do want to pick up what was a bit of a subliminal tension between Dennis's account and Nick's account, which is Dennis focused a bit on, or Dennis focused on the question of guarantees. Guarantees that certainly to the Israelis we didn't fulfill. Nick emphasized a bit more the fact that America was with Israel even throughout this crisis, perhaps despite the fact that we had made guarantees that we didn't fulfill. But I want to bring this through and look at the implications of the question of guarantees and ask all of our speakers just to say a word about is there any legacy in how America and its partners viewed this episode? Is there any legacy of this and how we approach the question of offering guarantees and how our allies look at America's guarantees over the past 50 years? Is there any legacy of this episode subsequent to this? Gentlemen? Dennis, you want to begin?
I mean, it's a very interesting question because there's no doubt it has been consciously in the mind of Israelis, not only in terms of how they speak among themselves and how they describe this period, to some extent even the way they've spoken with us. But here there's also an interesting kind of tension. Because on the one hand, the Israelis have said, look, we have to rely only on ourselves because you made commitments and you didn't live up to them. On the other hand, every single agreement we've had with the Israelis, they've sought American assurances and American commitments, which suggests that they really don't question whether we will live up to our commitments or assurances, because if they did, they wouldn't be so anxious to be sure to somehow elicit them. And that has been true, I mean, in every single negotiation I was a part of, we would spend as much time in our discussions over what we were over what assurances they were seeking, what commitments they were seeking, as we did even in terms of trying to resolve the very issues that involved the Israelis with their neighbors. So I think as part of Israel's overall ethos in terms of how they approach the world, what is clear is a sense that they have to be self-reliant. And part of that is also not to be a burden on the United States. That's is also part of the ethos. But it hasn't, at the same time, made them less desirous of gaining American commitments. To be fair, some of that is for the political benefit of having those commitments, much like Eshkol from May 14th on is determined to ensure that the U.S. understands what Israel's going to do. And that's why he constantly gives, why he's ready to play for time, why he's ready to continue to have discussions with us, even at a time when he's under enormous pressure from the military chiefs of staff and from the Israeli public later on, because this connection with the U.S. is so important. So some of the assurances, to be sure, are a function of trying to ensure that there's a favorable political climate afterwards and that the U.S. will be there to help protect Israel on the world stage against other kinds of pressures. But there is a bit of an irony. On the one hand, you can't trust external commitments, and yet that's what you seek all the time in these negotiations.
Any other remarks on this? Nick?
Yeah, I think that's the sort of ironic aspect of it. I think one should reflect a little bit on the big article that was in The Atlantic in 2015, I guess, or 2016, about Obama's foreign policy and his skepticism about what he regarded as the Washington think tank view that American credibility mattered, and that, and yet I, for one, believe it does matter because it helps you achieve good crisis management, the number of crises that don't happen, the historical record of things that don't happen, and whether it's the U.S. commitment with Britain and Russia with respect to Ukraine in 1994 that was not or has yet to be fulfilled, or other such when countries can't rely on the United States, then the whole system of order that we've grown up with is at risk. And it's bad enough with ordinary weapons, it's worse with nuclear weapons.
Michael?
I find this episode curious and anomalous because the importance of keeping commitments was an enormously powerful theme in American foreign policy during the Cold War. You've heard the rationale. One of the rationales for persevering in Vietnam at great cost was that the United States had made a commitment. And in his then celebrated foreign affairs essay just before becoming National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger said something like, I'm paraphrasing here, "The rights and wrongs of Vietnam no longer matter. Other nations can gear their policies to ours only if they are confident that we will keep our commitments, and therefore we have to keep it." And the question of the credibility of the American commitment to defend Europe was perhaps the most important issue in American policy toward Europe from I would say Sputnik to the middle of the 1960s. For about a decade, that's all anybody ever talked about. So for the United States to make a commitment that is so cavalier, that was so cavalier, seems to me to be odd because it's in contrast to the whole thrust of American foreign policy. So that leads me to two questions that I'd like to ask Dennis and Nick. First, if this was a serious commitment in 1957, why wasn't it made public? Because this was obviously intended to deter Egypt from doing what it did. The American conception of deterrence was to make it public, to make it visible, to engage in some version of Schelling's throwing away the steering wheel, so the other party knows that you are going to do this. Why was it not made public? If we know, maybe we don't know. Second, I'm a little puzzled by one feature of Johnson's behavior in the crisis leading up to the war, because there was the issue of whether the United States would open the straits, and that led to this issue of the regatta, which fell apart. Incidentally, let me ask you both. I hadn't thought of this question before, but the Johnson position was, we can't do this unless other people join us. Now, for the United States, historically, especially in the Cold War, that was often an excuse for not doing anything. Was that the case here, or was there serious interest in doing it? But second, the second issue with which Johnson and the Israelis, especially Eban, sparred was whether the United States would be with Israel. And Johnson had this line that he kept repeating, "You will not be alone unless you go alone." My question is why? I would have thought that would have been a pretty cheap assurance for Johnson to give, especially since the American military was confident that Israel would win the war, as indeed was the Israeli military, although it has to be said that the war that they expected to win was not the war that they fought. They expected only to fight on the Southern Front. They expected a repeat of 1956. Dayan, as we know, as the record says, as is well known, was dead set against fighting either in the West Bank or especially to the north, and the people in the north came and the Northern Command basically dragged them into it. So why wouldn't Johnson even give a concession which would seem to be purely nominal? Do you really think that this would drag the United States into the war?
Okay, 3 questions. Actually, Nick, do you want to start with this, and then we'll move back to Dennis?
Well, first of all, the Israelis may have been confident that they were going to win, but don't forget that Yitzhak Rabin had a nervous breakdown before the war. I mean, he clearly wasn't so sure, and the stress was enormous. So I don't think one should forget about that in looking back. Why was the Eisenhower commitment secret? I think because Eisenhower had to be persuaded over time that the Israeli participation in the Suez crisis was different from the British and the French, and they had a better justification for doing it, and therefore, but still, he didn't want any public vindication of the Israeli attack on Egypt in 1956, and I think that's why it was done privately, and it was a big mistake, and oddly enough forgotten, even though he published it in his memoirs. I mean, who reads memoirs? Right? Historians read memoirs. It's interesting because I wrote about the settlement of the Suez Crisis as a senior in college after the publication of Waging Peace. I don't recall, I'll have to go back and check the paper, but I don't recall reading the aide memoir in the back of Waging Peace. I think that Johnson probably, almost certainly believed he needed Congress in order to make any commitments to anybody, and he wasn't going to get it, and he wasn't going to act alone. I mean, why did he get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution? It's because he thought that Truman had made a big mistake in not obtaining a resolution for the Korean War. What he didn't know was that Truman talked to the congressional leadership in 1950 about a resolution, and they said, no, we could just do it. We don't want to listen to any more speeches by Bob Taft. Quote, unquote.
Nick, I think you're essentially right about why it was private. There's an additional factor why he wants it private. Eisenhower is of the view that any public association with Israel is bad for us. And he turns down every Israeli request for arms. He thinks that'll be a disaster with the Arabs. And so here, he does feel that he doesn't want to somehow look like he sanctioned and that he felt the Israelis had no right to ask for any assurances as they got out. Nonetheless, he did see Nasser's behavior, by the way, one of which was Nasser promises Dag Hammarskjöld that he will not send his forces into Gaza after the Israelis get out. And then, of course, he goes and sends his forces into Gaza. And Eisenhower writes about this and says, it was unfortunate. Literally, that's what he says. It's unfortunate. He says, but he'll pay a price for that. But of course, he pays no price for it. So there's very much in the Eisenhower administration a sense that any association with Israel comes at high cost to the United States. So the idea that we would make a public commitment to Israel, rather than seeing its deterrent value, he saw it as costing us something. And I think the only thing I would add on the point on why seek to do the regatta, which was actually the real name of it, as you correctly say, why not just organize it ourselves? Why require something that was more collective? Why go through the UN? He felt he had such little credibility with the Congress at this point. The way he could make the case more persuasive to the Congress was if he had other nations joining in and if there was UN backing for it.
Okay, let's turn the floor over to your questions. First start here with Doug in the center. Center left, an unusual position for Doug.
First of all, I think you all made a persuasive case that history is actually worth knowing and is relevant, which is, my sense is still a minority view in official circles in Washington, and that's a problem that goes back before the current administration. But anyway, it was a very, very good discussion, and I compliment you on it. There has been in recent decades an inclination on the part of historians to argue that the '67 war was a little bit like Barbara Tuchman's image of World War I, that people just stumbled into it. That's not the sense that one would get from, Dennis, your presentation or Nick's presentation that addressed the run-up to the war. Yeah. I don't think Michael contradicted that. He just didn't address it. But I'd be interested in your comments on this fundamental question of why the war happened. And Nick made an emphatic point that it fitted the legal model of self-defense, but that's not entirely, that doesn't entirely address this point about was it a conscious war or was it something that people stumbled into?
So let me...
Yeah, but by the same token, can I also add on to this? Was it preventable if Johnson had convinced Outant to slow down the UNEF decision, or if we had gotten our allies to take certain actions? It's the sort of flip side of this question.
So let me address both. There is, I do think, even because I didn't give the full backdrop, I didn't go through what are some of the factors that suggest that this was a war more by accident than by design, including on Nasser's part. That starts with the fact that the Soviets give him false information about the Israelis mobilizing on the Golan Heights with 12 to 14 brigades when the Israelis haven't done that. This, by the way, is not the first time the Soviets have done that with the Egyptians. Going back to 1960, February 1960, they do the same. The Egyptians, in response, actually send forces into the Sinai. The Israelis quietly say they have no intentions of doing anything against Syria. This is when the UAR exists. And the Israelis then, we also play a bit of a role. What ends up happening is that the Egyptians quietly then pull their forces out, and the Soviets sort of feel like, gee, we prevented. Maybe we found the way to use the Egyptians when it suits our purpose. They do it again in 1966, and then they do it here in May. Now, what has happened, because Nasser has been riding a losing streak, because Nasser is being accused of hiding behind the skirts of the UN. The Jordanian Prime Minister Wassi al-Tal says, "I'd rather die than have the UN on my territory." I mean, there's constant taunting of Nasser, and Nasser by the fall of '66 makes some quiet commitments to the Syrians about what he'll do in the event of the Israelis moving against them. So when he gets this information from the Soviets, this is when he feels the need that he has to do something. Now, again, this comes after there's been on April 7th, there's been a dogfight over Damascus where the Syrians lose all their planes and the Israelis, fly having lost none. So there's a backdrop to this, and there's a buildup to this, and when Nasser sends his forces in, for the first, there's a period of several days where he's not clear about where the forces are going to go, and it's not clear that he's actually going to ask the UN to leave Sharm el-Sheikh. It's Outant who basically says, look, it has to be all or nothing. You can't pull out some. So whether he intended to go where he was going or not, then he's in a position where he feels it hard to back down if there's no other reason than the fact suddenly he's being celebrated again. After being berated, now he's being celebrated. So there's a little bit of I think, a certain dynamic here, and I want to answer your question, but I want to put it in a larger context as well. The larger context is this was bound to happen at some point because Nasser created a built-in contradiction. The whole theme around which he wanted to lead the Arab world was avenging Palestine. That's the theme. It wasn't I'm going to build the economic power of the Arabs. I'm going to advance us in a social, political sense. I'm going to create modernization. No, it was avenging Palestine. On the one hand, he wanted to be the focal point in the Arab world, and avenging Palestine was, in fact, the idiom. On the other hand, he always wanted not necessarily to get drawn into a war that he might lose. And he knew he might lose based on what actually happened in 56 as opposed to the mythology that was built up around it. So that basic context created an almost inevitable tension that at some point, if he was going to stick to what was this broader idiom, it was going to be hard not to end up in a war at some point. Now, the answer about deterrable at this point, absolutely deterrable at this point. Had we acted in the UN? Had we threatened Egypt? We never do that. I mean, one of the interesting things is you have this gap in time from when Nasser announces sending his forces, mobilizing and sending his forces in, and blockading the straits. You have almost 5 days where that's the case. When you actually get serious numbers in there, so it's actually longer than 5 days. Now, in that intervening period, where were we? Why didn't we warn Nasser? Why didn't we say, you do this, and you're going to face a problem with us? Again, I come back to Vietnam. The Vietnam is so overwhelming in terms of its impact on us. And it's true in the case of our military. Our military says, look, let the Israelis take care of this. Don't draw us into this. Our estimates are that Israel will win in 10 days. That's what it was. But again, it's easy to say you'll win in 10 days. That kind of avoids the notion of, okay, you're winning, but what's the cost? It's not, the only measure isn't whether you win or lose. The measure, although obviously not losing is critical, but you can also win at a high price. 73, Israel wins, but it wins at a high price. So in any case, I think there were things we could have done that we did not do, both at the UN and in terms of making threats towards Nasser before he had crossed the threshold that made it irreversible. Once he puts 6 divisions on the border, it's one thing. He doesn't rush to send the forces to the border. And he doesn't blockade the straits. Had we sought to deter it and had we acted at the UN, then you would at least put yourself in a position where you had some greater ability maybe to stop this.
Michael?
Yeah. When I was learning the history of the origins of World War I, the Barbara Tuchman thesis was not taken seriously, and the conventional wisdom. I haven't read the 100th anniversary books. Maybe Nick has, and the conventional wisdom may have shifted, but the generally accepted explanation after Fritz Fischer's 2 books was that Germany was responsible for the war. Germany was willing to have a war. Germany took steps that were likely to lead to war, and the Germans were willing and in some ways welcomed the war because they thought it was going to be a European war that they would win. But it turned out to be a world war, and they lost. Similarly, Nasser committed acts of aggression. A blockade is an act of war, is it not, Nick?
It is.
So he did it because he thought he'd get away with it. He thought he'd win, but he lost.
By the way, our actions led him to believe that he could get away with it. We invite on June 3rd the Egyptian vice president to come to Washington, and there are no conditions for his coming. And Nasser has conveyed to us there are 2 things he won't do. He won't lift the blockade, and he won't draw his forces back from the border, and yet we invite him anyway. So his conclusion at that point is not such a bad conclusion.
On the World War I point, most of the literature for celebrating the 100th anniversary is not going to do the authors any credit because they haven't been in the German archives, and it's even worse than you presented. There's a German historian at Cornell who's written 2 brilliant books, one called Absolute Destruction on German military culture, and the other is Scrap of Paper on Making and Breaking International Law in World War I, that are must-reading for anybody interested in the period. Look, the fundamental thing about the 67 war, the 73 war, the 48 war, is a rejection of the idea that there should be a Jewish state in Palestine. And Nasser thought he would win. His generals thought they would win, or at least they told him they would win. And that was the objective, the destruction of Israel, and it didn't work. Interestingly enough, the Saudi king in the negotiations of 242 kept referring to American responsibility for this evil creation in 1948-49, and that it should be undone. So that's, to the extent that it wasn't accidental, that's a motivating rallying cry, and it's a rallying cry today, I'm afraid.
Michael, final
Dennis
word?
would know better.
Yeah, Rob raised the question of what we learn from this, of what governments have concluded and what we can learn from this about commitments. And as a result of this discussion and Dennis and Nick's response to my question, my conclusion is the lesson we should draw is a private commitment is not a commitment.
I'm afraid that I have to apologize to Rafi and to Peter and others. Although this is 50 years late, we always play by the clock around here, and we conclude promptly at 2:00. So I want to thank Nick, Michael, and Dennis for taking us back 50 years. And I hope you will all agree that there are still some lessons that we can continue to learn from this very much alive episode in Middle East history. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Very good to see you. Very good to be on a panel with you.
Well done.
Thank you very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Very good. Thank you very much.
That's good. That's good, yeah. I agree. I mean, I've come to the conclusion a long time.